So I think the first thing we'll call Dr. Billy was, or the emphasis he was making is on retirement primarily. And I'm going to talk about that in a second, but I think where I would start with this is thinking about the engine, like the gasoline, behind the engine, because he mentioned his income's going to quintuple. So all this stuff is really contingent upon earning that income. And so you have to think of that as like your career. I guess we could, if we were to call it something, we'll call that like your career or your earning potential. You could call it that. So think of it like your earning potential within this profession you've spent a lot of time specializing in. There's an economic value to that, and it's substantial when you look at it for the remainder of your life. But there's also lots of risks to think about, because so if we don't want to go too far down the road of like deciding where it needs to go and like budgeting it until I think you've really thought about like, let's make sure even in like unforeseen circumstances that, that income is going to be coming in or somewhat predictable. So along those lines, or within that realm of unpredictability, I would say choosing the right practice is huge. And maybe Dr. Billy's already done this, but that's really something, even if you've already selected the right practice, it's something you're going to be, I would consistently be kind of thinking about as you start a job. And the reason, that's always important for all professions, but I think it's especially important for physicians because there's a lot of frustrations. The healthcare system has its problems, and physicians are feeling a lot of pressure as a result of that. So there's a lot of burnout and career changing. Surprisingly, we're seeing a lot more of that with people we work with, and desire to get out of medicine or retire early and that kind of thing. Or even just like, this practice is terrible, I need to switch. So I think making sure you're in the right fit practice, that's first of all starts when you're looking at jobs, but then once you accept the job, it continues into like actually experiencing it, because it's really difficult to know for sure. But there's warning signs, like and this starts to get into values. If like your job is taking everything you got, like in training, it a lot of times probably takes all the gas in the tank. You're kind of like drained when you get done. I think your job really, assuming you have values outside of work, you need to have some gas left in the tank when you get done. So some practices have a culture of working a ton or even demanding that. And that's a problem. And so you may be earning like 10x your income. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, you could be earning $10 billion a year. But if you have no ability to enjoy it, it's like, what's the point of that? Like, that's no fun. And so unless that is your life goal, I don't find many people, I haven't really come across people that are like that. And I don't think that's actually the way people work. Most people have values outside of work. And so you want to be aware of those and think about like, is my in-practice job congruent to that? Like, is it, and if not, how can I change that? Do I need to make a shift? Like, maybe I'm making a lot of money, but like, maybe I can shift to another practice that's not quite as much pay, but like is much more in line with values and gives me space and maybe even pays more per hour. That's a thing to be thinking about. The reason is because, so like, well, first of all, you want to be happy in your work, but when you start to talk about your finances, like, you got to be careful how far you go down the road of starting to, so we're talking about budgeting for the new income. You have to be really careful about how far you go down that road of like starting to direct your dollars until you're confident in the position. I would be super hesitant in the world of healthcare today to be, planning, especially for like concrete stuff, particularly for things that are like long-term obligations, until I'm really comfortable with the job. So that's an important thing, thinking about the practice, making sure it's going to be a fit. And maybe you're not so confident about that. So that is a reason to like build in a lot more margin than normal. So maybe you are looking at your job and like, it's a new city, new practice, new people. I don't know anybody. I'm unsure about it. It's going to pay well, but I'm not sure. So it could be that you're like, let's go ahead and pretend or plan as if I'm going to make $300 a year, even though I know I'm making $500 a year. Maybe you're not like living like a resident. I'm sure you've heard that terminology, but you're being modest and you're building in some margin, just to kind of cover you wiggle room wise. That's a very reasonable strategy. So that's the first thing, thinking about the practice as you make this transition, because it's going to be the gasoline that's going to drive all this financial stuff. The second thing I'll throw out there kind of ties into the same thing around, your income or your ability to earn your income. So going back to the economics of your ability to earn an income, that could be thrown off if the practice is not a fit, which we just talked about. But it could also be thrown out of whack if something like out of your control happens with your health, or you unexpectedly pass away, or you have a burnout situation where you got to take a break or something. So these are kind of like the worst case scenarios that I think it's important to kind of cover your bases there. Nowadays, there's lots of good ways to cover these, like insurances for like the unexpected disability scenario or the unexpected death scenario. You can get insurance when you're young and relatively healthy for pretty inexpensive, and your work's going to provide some. But just working through those numbers to make sure that you're covering that adequately is a big deal for the same reasons I just mentioned with making sure a good fit in the practice. And then, for the unforeseen like break from work, like it's hard to get insurance for that, but that can be solved by having like adequate cash reserves, like an emergency fund type of thing. Those are just good baseline things to do before you start socking away all your money and, buying houses and that kind of thing. So thinking about disability insurance, life insurance, and maybe having a rainy day fund that's going to cover you in the event of unexpected. And both of those revolve around unexpected future as it relates to earning an income. The next thing I'll throw out, and I promise I'm going to circle back to retirement, but I really strongly believe all these things are much more important. Well, maybe not more important, but I think they should be a higher priority than thinking about retirement, mainly because they interrelate so much, and it's very difficult to do retirement adequately without thinking about all this stuff. Third thing I'll throw out, student loans. So hopefully Dr. Billy doesn't have student loans. That'd be great. But, if I'm a betting man, which I'm not, but if I was, I'd be like betting money that he does, obviously, as a physician. And so thinking about what the student loan plan is basically, like, what's the job? Is it qualified for PSLF? Is there any forgiveness programs? What's that going to look like? How's that fit into the equation of my finances? What are the payments going to be? It's a little complicated to figure out what payments are going to be for like PSLF type things because it's income based, but you can run the numbers, or we can run the numbers. It's an important thing to kind of carve out that in your plan before we start to get to this other stuff, especially forgiveness programs and PSLF, because those are going to be payments you got to make. Now, if you're not going for PSLF and you still have student loans, then it's a question of like, are there other forgiveness programs? Or if not, like, how quickly do you want to pay it off? And that starts to get into like priorities a little bit and like what's most important in your values. But like, I'm going to make an assumption that most of you guys would like to pay it off pretty aggressively if you're not going to get forgiveness. So maybe it's like a 10-year period, or maybe it's a 5-year period. I don't know. Whatever that is for you, or whatever the goal is there, go ahead and figure out what the payment is going to be to make that happen. And then that needs to be kind of like the first line item you're budgeting for in this new earning situation. Next thing on the list I would think about is taxes. And this is really important. I think, first of all, I think this is a little more obvious example, but it's nonetheless important, is that you have to pay taxes. Taxes will come out. Well, unless you're doing like an independent contractor deal or self-employed, assuming you're an employee, taxes are going to come out. And if you're not, you're going to have to eventually pay them. So you want to know, like, what is that actually going to be? What is my tax bill going to be ahead of time before you start? Same reason as the other things. Like, we want to do these things before we start like allocating all the dollars. We want to know what we're working with and make sure it's covered before we start like putting money into buckets, essentially. So you can figure that out. Like, it's a logical thing you can calculate. And I'm talking about like, what do you need to pay, or what will you expect to pay in taxes? And so the most common things you're going to pay are like federal tax. That's pretty straightforward. You can just, and even there's calculators online that you can run those numbers on. State tax. Hopefully, maybe you're, fortunate in living in a state that doesn't have state income tax, like Florida or Tennessee or something. But most states do have state income tax, so you got to account for that next. And a lot of places have local income tax. Like where I live in Kentucky, we have state income tax and local income tax. And it's actually 2.75%, which is not, that's not huge, but it's not small. It's not tiny either when you start to see the dollars. So earmarking or carving out that money. And then you have Social Security tax, or, it's not technically a tax, but Social Security and Medicare payments. You can do the math on those and go ahead and figure out what's going to come out for that. And so sometimes there's some other local or regional based taxes that would come out. But it's important to go ahead and look at what all those things are going to be and do kind of a projection about what is going to be your tax burden. And then you can start to see, before anything happens, before I start doing things with my money, what's my take home pay? Because that's actually what you're working with. A lot of people start into practice and they think I'm going to make $500,000, but what does that even mean after tax? So what are you actually working with? If it's, some people, think incorrectly that they are going to pay 50% tax on that income level. That's too high. But if you're going off that assumption, that's $250,000 left over, after all the taxes come out. It's typically going to be a little lower than that, but you got to figure out the numbers so that you can kind of know what you're working with before we start to, divvy it up. And on top of that, understanding so tax shelters often exist within your work retirement plans. So you want to understand what's available with your work. I want to know all the options. Do I have a 401k? Do I have a 403b? Do I have a 457? Those are the most common work retirement plans that offer tax shelters. But sometimes there's other plans like cash balance plans or pension plans that are going to be really good tax shelters that exist, or HSAs. HSAs are a great one that can exist within your work setup. Most physicians in practice will want to max all those out. So I think, if I'm talking generally, I would say I would go ahead and assume all those get maxed out. Now the 457 plan, you have to be a little careful with because it depends on what specifically type of 457B plan you have. But assuming, it's a better one, which is the governmental type, you definitely lean towards maxing all those plans out just because they are very good tax shelters and you only get so much of them. But making sure you understand what those are, first of all, and then starting to kind of divvy that up as well. And that also, affects that first calculation about how much tax is going to be paid ultimately. So we want to get that lower, like the tax bill, if possible. So understanding taxes starts to give you an idea of what you have to work with.